The American system of government was designed around a simple but profound idea. No person, institution, or branch of government should be trusted with unchecked power. To prevent the concentration of authority, the Constitution created a system of checks and balances, a structure in which the legislative, executive, and judicial branches each have distinct powers and responsibilities, along with the ability to limit the actions of the others. The goal is not efficiency, it's accountability. By dividing power among competing institutions, the system is designed to prevent abuse, protect individual liberties, and ensure that the government remains responsive to the people. But what happens when those checks begin to weaken? What happens when Congress fails to exercise oversight? When presidents push the boundaries of executive authority? Or when courts accumulate increasing influence with limited accountability? Can a constitutional system designed to prevent tyranny still function when the institutions responsible for checking one another stop doing so? To explore these questions, we turn to experts from across the Democracy Group Podcast Network, an initiative of the McCourtney Institute of Democracy. Throughout this video, you're going to hear insights from constitutional scholars, historians, legal experts, former elected officials, ethics advocates, and democracy reformers who have spent years studying the American system of government. Together, they're going to explain how checks and balances are supposed to work, how each branch of government constrains the other, where many believe the system is failing and falling short today, and what sort of reforms could strengthen democratic accountability in the future. Understanding checks and balances isn't just a civics lesson. It's essential to understanding how power operates in America, and what citizens can do when institutions designed to restrain that power begin to falter. Let's start this lesson with what are checks and balances. Checks and balances refers to a system in which the different branches of government have specific powers that allow them to limit or override the actions of the other branches. The primary purpose is to ensure that no single individual or institution can accumulate excessive power or act unilaterally without oversight. And this comes in the form of both formal and informal checks and balances. We're going to first hear from Adiv Noti, the executive director at Campaign Legal Center, who's going to explain why these formal checks and balances are in place.
The founders of our country anticipated that there would come times when there might be people in charge of the Congress or people who are elected president of the United States who would want to take on more power and more control over the country than the Constitution gives them. And so the design from the beginning was to have this system of what we call checks and balances, so that no one person or one entity in the government can take on more power than what the Constitution allots them. For example, if a president tries to take over the role of making laws for the country, which is a role given to Congress, both Congress and the courts have the power and the ability to stop the president from doing that. And the same is true if one of the other branches tries to exceed its constitutional authority. So each branch has the power and the ability through the constitutional process to keep the other branch in its correct place, so to speak.
Kedrick Payne leads the ethics program at Campaign Legal Center, where he works to strengthen ethics laws and hold public officials accountable at the federal, state, and local levels. He's going to explain how these informal checks function.
One of the key principles of our democracy is that we have checks and balances that ensure that the different branches of the government are held within the limits of the authority that they should have. The current breakdown of ethics norms challenges that, because not only do you have formal checks and balances, but you have informal checks and balances. The ethics norms are part of those informal checks. It is expected that a president will follow certain ethics traditions so that they can avoid the political pressure and the public pressure that can distract them from achieving their agenda. But we are currently in a situation where the president has no problem with dealing with the ethics scandals that follow all of his financial interests that are tied up with his official acts. and he is still able to push through his political agenda. When a person is able to do both, to have ethics scandals and to have legislative success, then you have no check, no balance, and you have a deterioration of our democracy.
Now, why do checks and balances exist? Some might believe that these create too much bureaucratic red tape. Political scientist Kevin Smith, though, explains that this is a feature, not a bug.
One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that federal executive branch agencies, in fact, any public bureaucracy, is not designed to be efficient. The whole of the United States government is not designed to be efficient. And I'll say that again. It is not designed to be efficient. And it was very, very deliberately designed that way. What the government is designed to be is responsive. It's designed to treat people as equals before the law. This is why you have all that red tape and process and bureaucracy. A lot of it is to ensure equality of treatment.
Without these checks and balances, the system can slide toward state capture and corruption. Simone Leeper, host of Democracy Decoded, discusses this concern with Jody Vittori, professor of practice and co-chair of the Global Politics and Security Program at Georgetown University. We'll also hear from former U.S. Representative Charlie Dent, who's going to argue that the traditional system of checks and balances is increasingly being taken over by partisan loyalty.
Georgetown professor Jody Vittori once again. She is concerned about the possibility that the U.S. could slide into a kleptocracy, which is essentially a government by thieves. The mechanism for this is what's called state capture, when corrupt officials bend the government at large toward their private gain. It sometimes happens to democracies.
In a state capture situation, you need impunity, and for that impunity, you need to stay in government. So you're going to start playing with the governing system itself to make sure you stay in government, because you don't want to go to jail. And you're going to both enable illegal activity, but take what was illegal activity or should be illegal activity and legalize it for your own benefit and for those of your friends. In a big economy like the United States or China, you can have these massive corruption scandals, but the normal person may not feel it. In a situation of state capture, the corruption has become so large that the average person can't miss it anymore.
I believe in many respects, we no longer have a system of separation of powers, but a system of separation of parties. It seems that the party controls, whichever party controls the presidency, that congressional Democrats see their obligation, and same with congressional Republicans, is to protect their president of that party. And so they will do things that, you think would fly in the face of what maybe Madison had intended, which is that, you defend your institutional interests. And so they're behaving in many respects as if they're operating in a parliamentary system rather than this system of separation of powers and checks and balances that we know.
Now, the United States federal government is divided into 3 co-equal branches to ensure a separation of powers. There's the legislative branch, which makes the law, the executive branch, which carries out and enforces the law, and the judicial branch, which interprets the law. The legislative branch is composed of Congress, which has the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive branch includes the president, vice president, and the cabinet. And the judicial branch consists of the Supreme Court and federal courts. This structure establishes a system of checks and balances. Each branch has enough power to perform its responsibilities, but not enough power to govern alone. Each also has specific powers to limit the actions of others, ensuring that no single branch gets too powerful. Let's start with the legislative branch, which is Congress. They have checks on both the executive and the judicial branch. So the checks that they have on the president or the executive branch are that they pass the laws that the president must enforce. They control funding or the power of the purse and can approve, deny, or restrict government spending. They can override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in chamber. The Senate also confirms appointments, including those of cabinet members, ambassadors, federal judges, and Supreme Court justices. The Senate ratifies treaties. They can investigate executive actions through hearings and subpoenas, and they can also impeach and remove officials. So the House would impeach, basically bring the charges forward, and then the Senate would conduct a trial and can remove the president or a federal judge from office. The checks that it has on the judicial branch is it has the power to create lower courts. It confirms federal judges and Supreme Court justices. It can impeach federal judges. It can amend the Constitution to overturn certain court interpretations, and it can pass revised laws in response to court decisions. Now, this branch of government breaks down into the Senate and the House of Representatives. And to help us understand this, Ken Katkin, professor of law at Northern Kentucky University, is going to explain the structure of Congress described in Article 1 of the Constitution and how it supports American democracy.
Congress consists of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So the concept of bicameralism is introduced right here in Section 1. Now, Section 1 doesn't tell us the significance of that, but by giving us this bicameral legislature, they're kind of setting it up that the legislative process is going to be somewhat difficult, that a bill isn't going to be able to become a law unless two separate bodies both separately agreed to pass the same bill as each other. So in principle, that makes it twice as hard to put something on the path to becoming a law as it would be if it only had to pass one body. Before I talked about how Article 1, Section 2, which gives us the House, is really the home of democracy in our Constitution. It's the most democratic portion of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 3 is the counterweight to that. It's where anti-democracy lives. It's a wedge against democracy. Everything about it is about making sure that the people can't really control the Congress. And the reason for that is that in the framers' sort of vision, I think to put it in a nutshell, they thought that no bill should become a law unless the bill was both popular and wise. And they thought that the House was there to make sure that the bills would be popular, that the House would not pass something unless it was something that people wanted, and that the Senate was there to make sure that the bills were wise, because the Senate would have the sort of the institutional independence because of these features we just talked about, that if the public were demanding the government to do something foolish, the Senate wouldn't have to care what the public thought, and they'd be this cooling chamber that could just cool things down and make sure nothing happened that was foolish, even if it's something that people demanded.
Hosts of Politics in Question, Lee Drutman and James Wallner, further explain why Congress was designed in this very way, to create a place for disagreement, conflict, negotiation, and compromise to take place.
So what you're saying is, and I think this is important, is that actually Congress is doing its job if there is disagreement and conflict. That's the purpose of a legislature, is to provide a forum where different perspectives can go up against each other, and it's a way in which we actually see representation happening. And so it's not just about solving public problems, although it's part of that, but it's also about how we solve public problems. And that is a crucial feature of a healthy legislature.
I love talking about this idea of Congress as a factory. And when you have this view, which I think is pervasive in society today, you begin to focus on problems and solutions, number one, and then you focus on outcomes. And you see members as like basically workers on a production line, and their job is to assemble a product according to a blueprint that has been designed elsewhere. There's an expertise there. And then politics becomes the application of expertise, not the adjudication of disagreement. But Congress and politics more broadly is, to borrow a phrase from Derrida, it's where you go to negotiate the non-negotiable. In a society where every citizen is both a ruler and ruled, you have to have a place where you can come together to make collective decisions. And I think this is a really important point. Congress is a place. That's what it is. It's a place. And it's a place where you're represented by the people you vote for. It's a place where lawmaking occurs. It's a place where actors, individuals, participate in an activity. But increasingly, what we see is that they're not participating in that activity. They're not resolving their disagreements via negotiation and bargaining and compromise, right? They're deferring to the executive branch and to the judiciary.
We're going to hear again from Ken Smith, who's going to return and explain the various responsibilities of Congress and the power that it possesses. Then we'll hear from Charlie Dent as he provides an insider's perspective on the role of Congress and the importance of oversight.
Our system is supposed to be centered around the legislature. I mean, that's the way that the Constitution was written. And the way some of this movement is moving towards, it's much more towards, what you might call an imperial presidency, where it revolves around the president. But in our system, in our constitutional system, it is Congress that is supposed to make the law. And it is the president that is supposed to enforce the law. It is Congress that creates the agencies. It's Congress which appropriates money and resources to those agencies. And there seems to be this growing expectation that, the people who set up that system have just got it wrong. What we need is power concentrated in the executive branch. And in order to effectively wield that power, they need to have much more unfettered control over the control of not just personnel, but the direction of agencies themselves. Congress has the power of the gods over agencies, literally life and death. It can create them, it can destroy them, and it decides how much money they get. And Congress, and I'm far from the only person to have been pointing this out over the years, has largely abdicated that responsibility. Oversight is messy, it's a grind, it's a chore.
Not sexy.
It doesn't get you a lot of stuff that you can put on the old Instagram. And even now you're seeing it. I mean, Congress is basically sitting back and saying, Elon and his crew over there are really, really raising a ruckus, aren't they? And that is essentially Congress saying, we're not doing our job, so I guess somebody else will do it. To defend members of Congress, I don't think the incentive structure is set up to where, oh my gosh, this is how I'm going to make my career, being a really good watchdog of executive branch agencies, or even being a really committed, in-depth, knowledgeable lawmaker. I'm going to make myself an expert in this area, and I'm really going to sort of devote my career to writing laws that are going to make a difference. Especially if you're interested in re-election, just purely in a short-term horizon sort of way. I don't think that makes a ton of sense to do that. What you're rewarded for now, I think, is being seen on the right team by a certain voting base. And you don't signal I'm on the right team by, getting yourself on an oversight committee and really devoting a significant chunk of your working life to those oversight activities.
I think in some respects, oversight, is a serious responsibility of Congress, and it's done on a daily basis. I was on the Homeland Security and Transportation and Infrastructure committees prior to coming to the Appropriations Committee. And when I was on the Homeland Security Committee, we spent a lot of our time, really looking at what the department was doing. At that time, it was a relatively new department, very new department. And so there were growing pains. And so we exercised a lot of oversight. A lot of it wasn't particular. Some of it wasn't, very glamorous or sexy, but it was necessary. But I find now that, the oversight seems to be more about, in many respects, getting your name on television, big high splash moments, as opposed to the hard, mundane work of, analyzing what these departments are doing, how they're spending money.
Unfortunately, some critics argue that Congress has not only abdicated its responsibilities, but also that some members have become vulnerable to conflicts of interest. Kedrick Payne of Campaign Legal Center is going to explain.
When you look in the legislative branch, we see conflicts of interest with members of Congress who own and trade stocks that are directly tied to decisions that they are making as lawmakers who control and have oversight over these various industries.
The second branch of government is the executive branch, which enforces the law and serves as a check on both the judicial and legislative branches. So the checks that the executive branch has on Congress or the legislative branch is it can veto bills passed by Congress, it can call for special sessions of Congress under limited circumstances, and it can influence legislation through policy agendas and public persuasion. The checks on the judicial branch are is it nominates the federal judges and Supreme Court justices, and it also has clemency powers, including pardons and commutations for federal crimes. To understand some of this power, let's talk about executive orders. Rick Perlston, an American historian, writer, and journalist, and Douglas Brinkley, a professor of history at Rice University, is going to help us understand this presidential power through executive orders.
The people who founded the country, and especially the people who devised and kind of marketed the Constitution, were impassioned about the idea that the executive should not be too strong. Not only was the nation founded in overthrowing a king, but even the word they chose for the chief executive of the government, president, just means someone who presides over a meeting. So even in the language they chose, they demonstrated their allergy to concentrated authority and their terror that one person would be able to make the decisions without review that affected the population.
We really were trying to create a non-monarchy, an executive branch who did have a lot of leadway on what will become foreign affairs, but then a Congress and, of course, the judiciary. And if you look at 1800 onwards, you will see that there isn't a lot of executive orders. It's not in the Constitution. And what you get is really Abraham Lincoln during wartime. Lincoln not only declared habeas corpus, but Lincoln also did the Emancipation Proclamation, which you can informally call Executive Order number 1. But boy, is it a big one, as an example of presidential power.
Next, we're going to hear from Simone Leeper and Juan Proyeno, Chief Executive Officer of United Latin American Citizens, and they're going to discuss concerns around the growth of presidential power and what they believe that could mean for American democracy.
Protesting is protected speech under the First Amendment. But Trump declared that these protests constituted, quote, danger of rebellion, and responded with soldiers. In effect, he declared that a situation he claimed was an emergency granted him extraordinary powers. And in the months following this flashpoint in LA, we've seen a troubling trend of the Trump administration deploying the military for domestic affairs, including, most notably, in Washington, D.C.
For us, there's a real concern that democracy is at stake, right? That there's a rise of authoritarianism in this country, and that without the legal protections, we will really be at a significant disadvantage. The fact that this administration also has the benefit of a Supreme Court where Trump has really been able to remake it essentially in his own image or to his likeness is a serious concern.
The question keeps arising. Can the Trump administration do that? Can the president allow Elon Musk unrestricted access to hundreds of millions of Americans' most sensitive government data? Can he fire the leaders of independent government agencies at whim? Can he revoke FEMA aid from American communities hit by natural disasters? Can he unilaterally impose tariffs? Can he cancel scientific research grants and student loan programs? Can he dismantle the Department of Education? Can he end birthright citizenship with the stroke of a pen? Can Trump use the Department of Justice to silence his political enemies and quash dissent? Amid all of these questions, one thing is clear. The Trump administration is testing the legal constraints of the presidency with an array of actions that the courts, Congress, and the public have never seen before.
Now Kedrick Payne is going to return to outline what he sees as corruption within the executive branch and efforts made by President Trump to consolidate power.
The average person has to care about corruption at the highest level because sooner or later, this corruption will also trickle down to the state and the local level. If you have a tone set at the top that ethics is not a priority, and that public officials can focus on their own personal profit and not public service, the public will lose trust in government, and our entire democracy is chipped away at by this improper conduct. When it comes to fighting corruption in the government, especially in the executive branch, there are all of these mechanisms that were set up immediately following Watergate. And Trump has directly attacked each one of those enforcement mechanisms. First, he attacked the inspectors general. Trump removed the heads of these offices without cause and without following the law, which requires a 30-day notice to Congress. Trump also removed the head of the Office of Government Ethics. This is the office in charge for administering the ethics compliance program across the entire executive branch. Without that head in place, you fall into a tone in the government where ethics are not prioritized, and you have the ability for many agency officials to completely ignore the conflict of interest laws. And then also, Trump removed the head of the Office of Special Counsel. This is the person who is in charge of making sure that political appointees are not engaged in political or campaign activity while working for the taxpayers. It is a very important position that is sometimes overlooked, but it cannot be overstated how important it is to make sure that you don't have officials tied to administration also campaigning for other political officials.
The tone Kedrick is talking about, in which ethics rules are optional, it can have immediate consequences. Under Trump, it means key government positions are staffed by people plucked straight from industries they are supposed to regulate.
For example, about 21 former lobbyists are in the administration now. You usually wouldn't see this type of a situation because there are rules in place to make sure that you don't have people leaving the industry and then coming back to work in the federal government that regulates that exact same industry. However, the Trump administration does not have the same ethical standards that we've seen in the past. Trump has attacked the parts of the government that are designed to fight corruption. The part of the DOJ that is there to fight against corruption at the state and local level, the Public Integrity Unit has been dismantled. And you also have a policy within the Department of Justice that has deprioritized enforcing laws related to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Foreign Agent Registration Act. All of that means that corruption that comes from foreign parties as well as domestic activity have been put into a category where there's lack of enforcement.
The third branch of government is the judicial branch, which interprets the law and the Constitution and serves as a check on the legislative and the executive branches. So the checks that it has on Congress, it can declare laws unconstitutional through judicial review. The checks that it has on the president and the executive branch, it can rule executive actions, regulations, and executive orders unconstitutional or unlawful. They can also require executive officials to follow the law. A famous example is the Supreme Court case United States versus Nixon, in which the court required President Richard Nixon to release evidence during the Watergate investigations. Leigh Littman, professor of law at the University of Michigan and former Supreme Court clerk, is going to talk with Simone Leeper about how the power of the courts has actually grown and provides examples of this influence.
The U.S. Supreme Court holds immense power as the head of one of the three co-equal branches of government. But in recent years, the court has made a series of decisions that seem to undermine the rules upholding American democracy, and which have reversed decades of work by prior courts. And unlike members of the other two branches of government, justices aren't elected for a term at a time. They instead are appointed for life after being nominated by the president and confirmed by Congress. But after that, there's little structure to hold them accountable when concerns arise. Leah Littman wants to make more Americans aware that the Supreme Court is rolling back popular laws, canceling generations of work by a branch of government, Congress, whose members are elected directly by the American people.
The Supreme Court has become so far removed from the people and so unconstrained in different ways, whether that's through Congress, whether that's through the media, whether that is through the public. It is important for people to almost reason backwards and ask, what's an issue I care about? And then try to figure out what role has the Supreme Court had in that area or as to that issue. And I think that would be a very illuminating exercise for people to see just how powerful the Supreme Court is.
We need a Supreme Court that issues decisions that uphold American democracy, not undermine it. But in recent years, the court's decisions on voting rights, partisan gerrymandering, and campaign finance have done and continue to do damage to voters, American democracy, and to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself. At this point, it's become clear that Congress must step up. It has the constitutional authority to correct many, though not all, of the court's most egregious anti-democratic rulings. When a person is asked whether they trust the Supreme Court, the answer ought to be a swift and easy yes. But to get to that day, we clearly have work to do. And serious, consistent, and substantial legislative effort to restore American democracy may be the only remedy we have left.
But what kind of problems does growing power create? Chris King, co-founder and chief counsel of Demand Justice, argues that it can erode and make the courts less legitimate.
So I think that there definitely is a legitimacy crisis. I actually think that that's a symptom of the problem as opposed to the problem itself. I think right now, when you think about the branches of government, the courts really rely on trust. They rely on legitimacy. Sort of Alexander Hamilton talked about the fact that the executive branch has an army and Congress has the power of the purse. The court relies on its legitimacy. And when that trust is lost, you sort of break down this whole third branch of government. But I think it's reflective of the bigger problem, which is that our judiciary has become too powerful and it's become too unbalanced. And when we think about balance, I want to encourage people to not just think about balance between Democratic-appointed and Republican-appointed justices. There definitely is imbalance there with 6 Republican-appointed justices and only 3 Democratic. But also to think about balance with respect to our 3 branches of government. And we think about checks and balances. And right now, the judiciary is getting more and more power. It's taking away the ability of the executive, the president, and the Congress to solve our nation's problems. And it's sort of running out of control. And I think that that is sort of the bigger problem that we need to grapple with when we think about our democracy.
Once again, we're going to hear from Kedrick Payne and Chris King describe what they see as ethical concerns within the U.S. Supreme Court and how those concerns can erode public trust in the system of checks and balances.
We are also seeing that there are conflicts of interest within the U.S. Supreme Court. There have been multiple scandals that have come up over the past few years where members of the court have received gifts and other special benefits from wealthy special interests. And those parties that have provided those benefits are either directly or indirectly tied to parties that appear before the court. With the Justice Thomas situation, you have undeniable evidence that he received gifts, which included the payment of tuition for a relative and also the purchase of the home in which his mother lives, yet there was no enforcement. So the pure takeaway of the Justice Thomas ethics scandal is that there is no enforcement of ethics rules within the court. First, you would expect that the members of the court would be well aware of the ethics rules and would try to avoid even the appearance of violation of those rules. Second, when you do have a potential violation, you would expect that you could have an investigation and that the public will be presented with the facts to know whether or not something did go wrong. And what we've seen is that the court does not seem committed to clearing the public record to let the American people know if, in fact, these violations have occurred.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the Supreme Court generally is that we don't think of it as another political branch of government, and we don't think of it, therefore, as subject to the same kind of lobbying and pressures that I think we're accustomed to when it comes to Congress or the White House. And what I think the story reveals, in fact, is that conservatives have been lobbying the Supreme Court in very much the same pay-to-play ways that they would lobby a member of Congress. And so you had a whistleblower come forward here who had been actively involved in creating this infrastructure in which they would recruit ultra-conservative religious activists who were wealthy donors. And these donors would donate money to the Supreme Court Historical Society so that they could get invited to events and hobnob with justices, and then start inviting them to dinner and taking them out on vacations and sort of getting to know them. And the purpose of this was so that the justices would feel more inclined and understand the base of support that is there if they were to abandon precedent and reach more and more conservative rulings.
All right, so far, we've seen how the three branches of government are supposed to happen and what happens when checks and balances weaken, allowing power to accumulate to a single branch. So now let's turn our attention to how these systems can be strengthened. So that way we have a more effective and accountable governance. We'll first explore how to engage Congress. Kevin Kosar and Adiv Noti offer recommendations for encouraging Congress to exercise their power that was granted to them by the Constitution and more effectively check the other branches of government.
What do you understand your job to be as a member of Congress? What is your duty as this constitutional actor? And that's just something that's going to take all of us. We're just going to have to spend a lot of time banging on Congress and reminding them of their constitutional duties, the role they play in the separation of power system. And we're also, beyond beating them over the head, reminding them of these things, I think we are going to have to figure out how to make the incentives align so that members of Congress feel incentivized to behave as constitutional actors.
There are two things that Congress needs to do to really fulfill its role in the system of checks and balances. One is now. Congress needs to reassert its authority as a co-equal independent branch of government, which was really unquestioned for a couple hundred years, and say, we're elected separately. We have our own powers that do not derive from and are completely separate from the president's, and we're going to assert those powers and not just be secondary in government to the presidency. There have been little flashes of that potentially happening here and there. I suspect as we get closer to the end of the president's term, and he can't run again. So I think we'll see a little bit more bravery, for lack of a better word, from Congress in that area. But that needs to start happening now. The other thing that Congress needs to do is to change the laws and the legal framework around our government and our elections to try to make sure we never get into this situation again, to try to make it harder for authoritarians to exert the sort of power that we're seeing the current administration try to wield. There is pushback happening through the courts, through lawsuits that Campaign Legal Center and others are bringing. But it's really incumbent on Congress to pass laws to try to make it so that we don't get into this position again. And we don't need to go to court because the actions don't happen in the first place because Congress has spoken to them. So both of those are really key actions that Congress needs to take.
In the discussion against presidential power, Adiv Noti and Kedrick Payne explain how legal safeguards, public accountability, and civic engagement can help deter executive overreach.
The whole reason we exist is because we rebelled against this idea of authoritarian rule. And so when we see a presidential administration that seems in many ways determined to just rule by fiat and not particularly care whether its actions are consistent with law and consistent with the Constitution, it causes us to have to reassert those founding ideals, the bedrock principles of what it means to be American, what it means to have an American system of government. So far, the fight against this attempted authoritarianism is succeeding. There are at least two main tracks in the fight against authoritarianism that Campaign Legal Center and our allies are engaged in. One is to directly confront the illegal activity by the administration, primarily through litigation, which we have done by suing to block the president's executive order on elections, through blocking, in part, his order on birthright citizenship, by challenging the illegal actions of DOGE when it comes to changing how the whole federal government works. And I think that sort of litigation is a key prong in the strategy to ensure that there is oversight from the judiciary of the administration's actions. The other sort of aspect of preventing this authoritarianism from taking root is through the legal framework around how our government operates and how our elections operate. We need to lay the groundwork for strengthening those processes, strengthening the election process, strengthening the ethics process, strengthening the appointments process, so that it becomes much harder in the future for people to be appointed into positions of power and to abuse those positions to try to ensconce themselves and their allies into government.
What can be done about this is to have the public put more pressure on the president. In the past, presidents have tried to avoid even the distraction of a scandal involving their financial interests to get in the way of their policy and their agenda. However, Trump has not had to make that decision between a distraction of a scandal versus pushing through his agenda. If the public puts pressure on their representatives and on their other elected officials, then we can have a situation where the president knows that the political pressure and the public pressure will keep him from profiting off of the presidency.
In discussion about reforming the courts, we're going to hear again from Chris King outlining several reforms that he believes could increase accountability, strengthen ethics rules, and rebalance the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court of the United States is actually the only court in the entire country that does not have a binding code of ethics. It does not have an enforceable code of ethics. And I think the theory, perhaps, is that because they are Supreme Court justices, they are above reproach. They don't need a code of ethics because, of course, they're ethical. They're justices. And it's that mentality and sort of this putting them on a pedestal that I think is corrosive. And instead of accountability, because they're powerful, you sort of have corruption at the highest levels. You know, this is, again, a place where we'll see Congress stepping in, hopefully with more investigations into what exactly happened and how it happened and what the ethical issues are at play. But again, Congress has the ability to require the Supreme Court to have a binding code of ethics. And I think it's incredibly important to do this right away. So I think in terms of actually directing action, it is about lobbying members of Congress to understand that they need to step in and that they have tools available. I think that Supreme Court expansion in particular would be a way to reform the court and add balance to it. You know, I think a lot of times, because the size of the Supreme Court has been 9 for as long as you and I have been alive, people think like that's the way that it's always been, or that's the size of the court is set in the Constitution. And that's actually not true. Congress has changed the size of the Supreme Court 7 times before. It's very much within their power and ability to change the size of the court again now to restore balance. And I think that forcing our elected leaders to understand that the court is a problem and to do something about it is really going to be important to effecting change.
The fourth check that I want to bring to your attention is you. The Constitution created 3 branches of government, but it also assumes the existence of a fourth force, one that keeps the entire system functioning, and that's an engaged citizenry. As you've heard all the experts throughout this video, checks and balances are not automatic. Congress must be willing to exercise their oversight. Presidents must respect constitutional limits. Courts must maintain public trust and legitimacy. When any one branch accumulates too much power or fails to perform its responsibilities, the system is going to weaken. The good news is that you're not a powerless observer. You strengthen the system of checks and balances when you stay informed about how the government is working. You strengthen it when you pay attention to the actions of elected officials rather than just their rhetoric. You strengthen it when you contact your representatives, attend public meetings, support ethical governance, participate in elections, and hold leaders accountable regardless of their political party. But most importantly, you strengthen checks and balances when you resist the temptation to excuse abuses of power simply because they come from leaders that you support. The system only works when principles matter more than personalities. The founders understood that no constitution, no law, no institution could protect democracy on its own. A government of separated powers requires citizens who are willing to defend those principles when they're being tested. Checks and balances are not just merely a feature of American government. They're a responsibility shared by every American. The future strength of the system depends not only on what Congress, the president, or the courts choose to do, but what we choose to do as citizens.